HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The D Word, Making the Ultimate Decision About Your Marriage by Kate Anthony. Read by Kate Anthony. For Emmett. You are my reason for doing all that I do. I love you the most forever and ever. XOXO, Mom. And for women everywhere, you, my love, deserve to be happy. XOXO, Kate. Introduction. When I was in the depths of despair, struggling to decide whether or not to leave my marriage, I consulted a good friend. I wanted a burning bush. I wanted someone or something to tell me clearly, it's time to go. Or stay, and you'll get through this. Because at the end of the day, we want to know if whatever struggle we're going through is actually worth it. We want a guarantee that if we stick it out, it will have been for something, or conversely, that if we leave, what awaits on the other side will be better than this. There's a distinct line in the sand, and we just want to know if we should cross it. So I asked my friend Mark. We were in group couples therapy together. Yes, that's a thing. It's like couples therapy, but with other couples. In our group, we practiced something called imago therapy, in which we identified our emotional triggers, figured out what childhood wounds they stemmed from, and asked our partners to make specific changes to their behavior that would, theoretically, help us heal those wounds. It was all very controlled, and ultimately it saved everyone's marriage except mine. I turned to Mark because he was in his second marriage and had been through a divorce before. He was one of the only people I knew, besides my parents, who'd gotten divorced, and since we were in group couples therapy together, he had a pretty intimate knowledge of my marriage. Against our therapist's advice, our group had gotten pretty close outside of therapy, and every Saturday, after our 3-hour-long group session, we'd have a potluck at one of the couple's houses. At these dinners, we'd abandon the intensity of the afternoon's work in favor of laughter, food, and wine. The husbands even started a band called, of course, The Wounded Children. Our kids, of those of us who had them, were exactly a year apart, newborn 1 and 2 when we began. So they grew up together under the utterly bizarre circumstance of their parents bonding over marital strife and, ironically, childhood wounding. These potluck dinners were the perfect pressure release after deep, hard work, and it allowed us to avoid going straight home and stewing in our own relationship post-therapy. As much fun as we had with our cohort, I always knew my husband and I were in deeper trouble than the others. While many couples would talk about how it made them feel when their spouse didn't change the toilet paper roll, which, by the way, was a much more layered dynamic than you may think, my husband and I would talk about how the way he criticized me dredged up my feelings of having been emotionally abandoned as a child. And this was just scratching the surface of what was really going on. In addition to this group form of couples therapy, my husband and I were in individual couples therapy with one of the therapists who ran our group. I was also in my own therapy with another therapist, as was my husband, and we were both in 12-step programs. There was a lot of work happening and a lot of money being spent to try to save this marriage, but it only seemed to be getting worse. It's important to acknowledge here that we were privileged enough to be able to afford such work. Many are not. In addition, there are many cultural barriers that might bar couples from being able to engage in this kind of work, all of which I will address in later chapters. I truly didn't know what to do. I was drowning in misery, but I believed our imago therapists when they said that anything could be solved with imago therapy, so I kept trying. I believed one of our therapists, who was a children's specialist, when she told us that it was better for children to be raised by 2 unhappy parents than for the parents to separate. I believed that every relationship is 100-100, not 50-50, so if I gave it 100%, I could eventually fix this. But despite all this work, I was still miserable, and I really needed someone to tell me, should I stay or should I go? And so, at one of those dinners after therapy, I gathered the courage to ask Mark. He was smart and kind and introspective and curious and so damn gentle. If anyone could tell me what to do, it would be him. I took him aside, looked at him with wild desperation, and asked, "How do you know when it's time to leave?" He looked at me firmly but kindly and said, "When you know, you'll know." In case you're wondering, this was not the burning bush I was after. I'd been churning this question for 2 years, and here's this guy telling me you'll know when you know. The whole point was that I didn't know. I was pissed. But more than that, I was terrified. I'd done all of this work, and I still didn't know? What the fuck was wrong with me? I was moving through my life, marriage, motherhood in a numb dream, vacantly staring into closets, sinks full of dishes, grocery store aisles. This was who I was now. I was a Stepford wife, seemingly having it all together, but somehow not quite there. I made it all look good on the outside, but inside I was slowly dying. My self-esteem was crushed. I had everything I thought I ever wanted, and yet I was more miserable than I'd ever been in my life. And it was during one of those vacant staring sessions a few months later, as I was standing in my closet impassively staring at the jumble of clothes, that it hit me, like a frying pan upside my head, and suddenly I was more awake than I had been for years, because suddenly I knew. I knew that I had to leave my marriage, and not just to save myself from mindlessly meandering through my days, getting lost in closets and grocery store aisles. I had to do it for my son. We're told over and over again that we have to stay for our kids, that children from broken homes, a term I loathe, do less well in school, are damaged, and grow up to have poor coping and relationship skills. They become drug addicts and alcoholics. So we try, and then we try harder. We bend ourselves into pretzels trying to make this square peg fit into that round hole come hell or high water, because if we don't, our children will suffer. And we will have failed. At marriage, at parenting, at life. But in that moment in my closet, I saw clearly that my partnership with my husband was inherently flawed, that we were, and always had been, mismatched. That what we were modeling to our son wasn't what I wanted him to grow up to have for himself. That while I was projecting the perfect life with the perfect house, the perfect child, and picture-perfect moments, what I really had was a marriage devoid of truth, love, mutual respect, and substance. And that the longer I remained in such a marriage, the more devoid of truth, self-love, self-respect, and substance I became. That while I had this vision of myself as being strong and powerful, I was actually locked in a deeply codependent relationship dynamic, and I knew that the only way my young, innocent child had any chance at creating a healthy, happy, lasting, loving relationship in the future was for my husband and I to end our marriage. Now. In that moment, I knew that my husband and I brought out the worst in each other, and that staying in our marriage was keeping us from finding people we actually liked, with whom we could create meaningful, trusting bonds, and that if we could find that outside of each other, our son would have a chance at finding that for himself down the line. And I knew that if we stayed together, he stood absolutely zero chance of that. After a few more months of last-ditch effort work, on Christmas Eve of 2008, I finally blurted out those dreaded words, "I want a divorce." Dear listener, this is the absolute worst time to make this announcement. It makes for a really uncomfortable Christmas. If by the end of this book, this is your decision as well, I'll have told you how to do this better than I did. I'd always thought that if I was just a better communicator, if I was just smarter, skinnier, taller, prettier, funnier, took more responsibility, lowered my voice, raised my boobs, shrunk my hips, did more crafts, cooked better, had more interesting hobbies, then I'd be able to make my marriage work. Turns out, some marriages are simply unworkable, and no amount of Stepfordizing myself or my marriage was going to get us to happily ever after. Despite the fact that Mark's words, "when you know, you'll know," eventually proved true for me, as time went on, I knew there had to be a better way for the millions of women who struggle with this question every day. This book is my antidote to "when you know, you'll know." This book is a guide to your personal truth and clarity. This book is for the listener who's in the depths of despair, going through the most painful transition of her life. She's paralyzed with fear and desperate for answers. This book is for the listener who is simply questioning her marriage and wondering if there's perhaps something better out there, or if this is all marriage really is. She wants to know if the grass really is greener on the other side. She wants to know how she ended up in a marriage that makes her this unhappy in the first place, and how to avoid doing so again. She wants to know that if she leaves, she's not going to screw up her kids, and that she'll be okay in the end. This book will answer all of these questions and many more. This book is primarily written for cisgender heterosexual women married to cisgender heterosexual men, because those are the relationships that are most deeply impacted by the systemic structures that most affect relationships today. That being said, I have worked with a number of lesbian women over the years who resonate with my work and whose marriages also reflect these systemic biases. These women will also benefit from this book. And while I've mostly used ungendered language, there are sections in which my language is more gendered because the circumstances are also more clearly defined by gender. In addition, I talk mostly about marriage because that's the most common place these issues crop up. But women who are not married will also benefit from this book. This book will lead you to a place of clarity, from which you can make a truly informed and empowered decision. But here's the thing, my love. I need you to be ready for that. In order for you to get the most out of this book, you need to be ready for answers. For many of us, sitting in the in-between is preferable to getting to a place of clarity. In her book Untamed, Glennon Doyle calls this the choice between an uncomfortable truth and a comfortable lie. You know you can't continue on like this, but for many, the idea of finding out that they have to fully commit to their marriage or fully commit to leaving their marriage means that they no longer get to sit on a fence they've made their home. They no longer get to not know. In her book, Too Good to Leave, Too Bad to Stay, Mira Kirschenbaum talks about how her mother sat on that fence for 40 years, and how painful it was to watch her never choose happiness either way. I see this often with clients and even some close friends. This book asks you to get off the fence and choose. But more than that, it gives you the tools to do so. So the first thing I want you to do is to ask yourself if you're truly ready for answers. I've been helping women get these answers for over a decade. Thousands of women have gone through my programs and worked with me privately as a coach, and they have all gotten the answers they were seeking. Not always the answers they wanted, but always the answers they needed. Are you ready to find yours? This book will challenge you. You will feel confronted and even angry at some points. If you have the feeling of wanting to throw the book across the room while also holding it close to your heart, I've hit a nerve, and this book is absolutely for you. You may have a lot of feelings that you don't understand as you navigate this book, and you may wonder if they're normal. In my years of working as a coach, running programs for women, and running an active and engaged Facebook community for thousands of women, I can't tell you how many times I've heard women ask, "Is this normal?" But I think what they're really asking is the way I'm processing and experiencing X valid? And am I alone? My response is always the same. Yes, your feelings are valid. Your experience is valid. You, my love, are valid. And you are not alone. And so I say to you, whatever you experience while listening to this book is completely valid. And there are thousands like you. And the most important thing you can do is to have grace and compassion for yourself as you move through it. Give yourself breaks. Pat yourself on the back for learning something new about yourself. Please don't use it as a weapon to beat yourself up. I want you to really prepare for how you'll be with yourself when things get hard. Perhaps you'll promise yourself a walk to clear your head or a call to your best friend or therapist. This is what real self-care looks like. It's not just mani-pedis and massages. It's honoring yourself when things are hard and taking care of your emotional well-being always. Similarly, how do you want to honor yourself when you have a breakthrough or set and hold a new boundary? Maybe you'll buy yourself that cute skirt you've wanted for a while, or treat yourself to some froyo with all the toppings. Do something fun that feels like a treat. You deserve it. Fill out the following form to make these promises to yourself. I, blank, promise to honor myself and my process as I move through this book. When things get hard, I will, blank. When I have a breakthrough or find myself setting new boundaries, I will, blank. Signed, blank. Date, blank. It's important to note that doing this work may unearth some hidden trauma. So you might want to have a good coach or therapist in your corner to help you process things that come up. A good therapist should have advanced training in internal family systems, IFS, the work of John Gottman, emotionally focused therapy, EFT, or some other modality that addresses your particular concerns. If you're unable to afford therapy, if there are no good or available therapists in your area, if you're not ready for therapy, if there are cultural or other barriers that make therapy unavailable, or if you just don't want to go to therapy, that's fine too. Just please be good to yourself throughout this time. The section on self-care has some great tips. I strongly recommend that you have a journal on hand as you work through this book. There are a number of exercises for which you'll need one, and there may be several things that come up while you listen that journaling may help you process. Before we get into the meat of this book, I want to answer one of the most pressing questions and probably the biggest elephant in any room in which contemplating divorce is circulating. Should you stay in your marriage for your kids? From the day you became a mother, every decision in your life has been filtered through the lens of what's best for my kids, and no decision has been put through that filter more than this one. You may have avoided looking more deeply at your marriage up until now because you've heard a million times that divorce screws up kids. And you've determined that if divorce screws up kids, then you'll just have to suffer. You'll do anything to protect them, so you should stay, no matter how bad it is for you. And my guess is that you didn't buy this book because things are great. Let's take a moment to unravel this oft-stated myth about children and divorce and look at the science. In 2000, psychologist Judith Wallerstein wrote The Unexpected Legacy of Divorce, a 25-year landmark study. In it, she and her colleagues presented detailed case studies suggesting that most children of divorce grow up to become adults with an array of social and psychological problems, including depression, relationship issues, and often drug and alcohol abuse. Needless to say, these findings terrified a lot of people into staying in unhappy marriages for the sake of their children. With this data, it made perfect sense to sacrifice personal happiness for the mental health and safety of our children. In fact, this book was what informed my couples therapist when she insisted that I stay in my unhappy marriage. Later studies showed that the research Wallerstein and her colleagues did was not accurate, and her theories, though widely accepted and still quoted, have been debunked. Wallerstein had no control group, and she only interviewed 60 families from one county in California, many of whom were in disastrous marriages rife with domestic violence, economic insecurity, and other circumstances that would lead any child, whether their parents were divorced or not, to have lasting emotional issues. In the years since Wallerstein's study came out, there have been other, more controlled studies done that show the impact of divorce on kids in a different light. According to one study done in 2002 by E. Mavis Hetherington, a psychologist from the University of Virginia, and published in Scientific American, while many children are negatively impacted by divorce in the short term, most of the negative effects diminish by the end of the second year, and only a small handful of children suffer long term. Paul R. Amato, a sociologist at Penn State, did comparative studies of children several years after divorce, comparing children of married parents with those who experienced divorce at various ages. This study appeared in the same 2002 Scientific American article and followed children into their teen years and assessed academic performance, emotional and behavior problems, delinquency, self-concept, and social relationships. The studies found very little difference on all measures between the two control groups, suggesting that children from intact homes do not fare better in the long run than those from divorced homes. In other words, your kids will be affected in the short term because of course they will, but given the right support systems like therapy and parents who put their children's needs first, they can and will ultimately get through it relatively unscathed. In my own research, I've learned that there are two sets of kids who fare the worst in terms of mental health and ability to engage in healthy relationships as adults. The first are those whose parents remained in volatile, toxic, or high-conflict marriages. And the second are those who were dragged through bitter divorces in which they were used as pawns and put in the middle of a nasty fight. Two sets of children fare the best. Children whose parents remain together in healthy marriages, and those whose parents divorce amicably, putting their children at the center, not in the middle, of all their decisions. Both of these sets of kids tend to grow up to be healthy, well-adjusted adults. In other words, divorce itself isn't the culprit. Toxic relationships, whether in marriage or divorce, are the problem. The truth is that almost all divorces could be cooperatively mediated, if only the litigation system didn't prey upon our pain. Before going into mediation with my husband, I consulted a divorce attorney to better understand my legal rights, especially when it came to spousal and child support. Since mediators are neutral by definition and don't give legal advice, I needed to know what to even ask for once we got into mediation. In many states in the U.S., two factors are considered when calculating child support. One is income differential, and the other is percentage of custody. Because of this, the first thing this attorney wanted me to do was to accuse my husband of being an unfit parent, which he in no way was, so that I could gain full custody of our son and therefore get more child support, which I never said I wanted. If I accused my husband of being an unfit parent, we'd surely end up in protracted litigation as he fought to defend himself. And then my attorney would make a killing using my son as a pawn in this fabricated fight. I walked out of that attorney's office with a basic understanding of what I was legally entitled to and a horrible taste in my mouth about where this man wanted to take my divorce. But more than anything, I knew that had I been slightly more vulnerable, slightly more angry, and slightly more vindictive, I could easily have been persuaded to put my son in the middle of a nasty battle. As I've been working in this field for the last 10 years, I've heard numerous stories like this. One attorney I work with recounted a story of being on a panel at a divorce conference with a mediator and 2 litigators. The attorney asked one of the litigators, "How do you know when to stop litigating?" The litigator replied, "When the money runs out." In other words, no matter how many possible solutions may have presented themselves along the way, the litigator would continue to litigate until they could no longer be paid. Once the well ran dry, they'd find a solution, likely one that had presented itself months and thousands of dollars earlier, and settle. But until then, the litigators would add fuel to an already emotional fire, fanning the flames of anger and revenge and putting innocent children squarely in the middle of the divorce process, all for their own financial gain. Famed celebrity divorce attorney Laura Wasser told a story on my podcast of a case in which she and her opposing counsel had almost come to an agreement in court, when suddenly her opposing counsel brought up a totally unnecessary point which put a stop to the case they were about to settle. When Laura saw her opposing counsel in the hallway after court, she asked her what the hell happened. The opposing counsel replied, "I haven't even made my retainer yet." And so a nasty litigation raged on. And who suffered the most? The kids. So does divorce screw up kids? No. Being used as a pawn in an unnecessary fight, being used as a weapon to exact revenge, being told that one of their parents, one half of them, is a piece of shit, or otherwise bad-mouthing someone they deeply love, that will have a devastating effect on your kids. Having an amicable split in which personal responsibility is at the core, in which blame and shame are kept at bay, in which forgiveness and collaboration are the priority, all with the intent of putting your children at the center of every decision you make, will not screw up your kids. In fact, that will show them how to manage conflict and loss in healthy, mature ways, which is probably one of the most valuable lessons anyone can teach their children. If, by the end of this book, you choose to leave your marriage, you'll have enough information and insight to be able to do so in the most amicable and healthy way possible. But what if you have a totally vindictive husband who's swearing up and down that he's going to make this as difficult for you as possible? What if you live with an emotional and psychological abuser who will never agree to mediate a divorce and who assures you that they'll destroy you and take your kids in the process? Well, then, I'd say you're in a volatile and toxic marriage rife with power and control issues, and you probably need to leave for your kids. I'd also tell you to check the laws in your state because those threats usually hold no weight whatsoever and are simply used to scare you into submission. More on this later. It's commonly believed by victims of abuse that they need to stay in their volatile marriages in order to protect their kids from the toxicity of the other parent. And that's almost always false. Children who are raised in highly volatile households can suffer from PTSD and other emotional scars. Their imprinting around relationships can be permanently damaged, and they'll be more likely to continue the cycle of unhealthy relationships for another generation. Some women worry that if they divorce, their abusive partner would have unsupervised custody of their children. They reason that it's better to stay in the relationship so that they can protect their kids from being alone with an abuser. However, in a 2018 interview I conducted with clinical psychologist Dr. Linda Bortel, who specializes in working with such children, she said that staying with an emotionally abusive narcissist so that you can be there to run interference is not a healthy solution for kids. Dr. Bortel says that even if your kids have to be alone with the abuser half the week, they'll be completely away the other half. whereas they'll be with the abuser 100% of the time if you stay. If you stay, you're unintentionally co-signing the behavior, teaching your kids that this is okay. If you leave, you can create a loving, safe environment for them to grow up in, even if it's only 50% of the time.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?